right now, joining me, Alexander Salter, economics professor at the Rawls College of Business at Texas Tech University. Alexander, thank you, sir, for coming on.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm glad you're here. You actually have an op-ed in Law and Liberty entitled, "Can Congress Rein in the Fed?" I guess it's a great question. What do you think? Can they do it?
I think they can do it. The question is, do they want to? Even those in Congress who toe the line when it comes to rule of law issues and the primacy of the legislature among the three branches of government are hesitant to meddle with the central bank. I think that there's some prudence there and there's some foresight there, but I think what recent Americans have seen in terms of the really damaging inflation means that lawmakers have to give that basic position another look.
So they have to give it another look. And what does giving it another look like to us?
I think it means that the central bank, the Federal Reserve, can't really be left to be a judge in its own cause anymore. Congress should really step in and give it more guidance in terms of the concrete outcomes that the central bank should pursue. Right now, the Fed has a dual mandate. They're charged with maintaining stable prices and full employment, but both of those goals are pretty vague. They don't actually provide a whole lot of guidance about what concrete targets monetary policymakers are supposed to hit. I would like to see members of Congress get much more specific and write some legislation that tells the Fed, this is what we want you to hit. Here's the range that we expect you to fall within. You should have some freedom with respect to the tools that you're going to use to pursue your goals, but ultimately you got to make sure that you achieve this outcome, such as no more than 2% inflation, and ultimately deliver that year after year, not just some vaguely specified over some years in the future.
Okay, so first of all, bravo, because I'd love to see that. That's like, bring it on. Dreams come true. But passing legislation is not something Congress has actually become known for in the modern era. That's why their approval rating is in the teens, because they actually try to avoid, if they can, passing meaningful legislation, because it puts them on the record on one side or the other, which draws the ire of the voters. So there's always some nincompoop out there who thinks that the situation we're in is Putin's fault and therefore there's nothing we can do to fix it. But I agree with you. Legislation is what's needed. So what's the likelihood that when the Congress goes back to Republican control, they actually take the brave step of passing something?
I think if it's going to happen, it really does have to happen now. There are moments for these things. And although it's inevitable that the Fed will mess up again in the future, I'm not quite sure that there's going to be the possibility of getting the whole process under control in the future. You're absolutely right. For too long, members of Congress from both parties have basically abdicated their duty to be the first branch among equals of the federal government and to actually take charge of the federal government's operations, because a lot of that would require forcing difficult votes, and that makes running for re-election harder. But ultimately, unless we have some legislators step up and try and get control of this process, I'm worried the moment's going to be gone. I think it's similar to school choice, actually, another issue that we're seeing some progress on. This is the moment. If we don't see progress on that issue now, it's not going to happen. So I, for one, am very much hoping that if Republicans take control over Congress, we're actually going to see some legislation come out of maybe House Financial Services Committee in terms of getting the Fed under control, in terms of forcing them to be better stewards of the dollar's purchasing power.
So the legislation comes out, but we have a Democrat who's controlling the executive branch, and we need him to sign legislation into law. So it comes out and it kind of just sits waiting for a second term of President Trump, or?
There's a chance that this could actually have some bipartisan support. I think that when you look at Americans' wages that have been eroded by inflation ever since inflation started getting out of hand, that's not something that that's not something that's detrimental to only one side of the political spectrum. I think that you can get a lot of support from the left and the right in terms of stopping that process. The question is, can any attempt to stop that process overcome the strongly concentrated interest groups associated with the banking sector, the Federal Reserve itself, all the people and institutions in that network who really like discretionary monetary policy and don't at all want to have a tight leash? So I think that this is going to be another story of needing legislators to step up for the general public interest and push back against special interests that, although they have their reasons for opposing a policy like that, are ultimately more concerned with their prerogatives than the welfare of the American people.
Yeah, I agree. In your article, you talk about U.S. monetary policy, and you mention Alex Pollock's insightful essay on the Federal Reserve, and he brings up the history of it. And so last hour, I was talking about the craziness of Janet Yellen trying to forecast that gas prices would go up after the election and prepping us for another round of blaming Putin, when the truth is we are a net energy producer when we want to be, and that's all we have to do to drive prices down again is start producing American energy. So her deflection indicates that there's kind of a mental rot going on in the Biden administration that defies your point to history. The fact is we know how to get into a recession. We know how to get out. We've done it before. We know what causes it. We know how to, reverse it. But Janet Yellen being in charge of this is an untenable situation.
Yeah, I think that the Putin's price hike line was never more than just a party line. Quite frankly, there's not much to it. Prices were already trending upward ominously months and months before the invasion. So really trying to blame this on geopolitics doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Of course, there are supply side considerations when oil gets more expensive, when food, basic inputs get more expensive. Yeah, that's going to put upward pressure on prices in general. But really, you have to look to the culprit of the massive stimulus spending that was underwritten by the central bank. I don't think the government spending, as big as it was, would have done it by itself. It was added to the fact that it was quite literally supported by money printing by the Federal Reserve. At the time, I'm sure that they did what they thought was necessary to preserve the integrity of the financial system when everything was all uncertain following COVID. But when you increase the money supply by almost 35% in a single fiscal year, you're going to get upward pressure on prices. And so that's ultimately the culprit that we should be concerned about. These supply considerations, while real, are secondary, and we shouldn't try and put the cart before the horse here.
Yeah, no, I think that is a good orientation for us to assume. So when in your article where you talk about we've been here before, you literally put we've been here before. You talk about Mr. Pollock telling the story of Fed Chairman Paul Volcker's resolve to crush inflation and what the Volcker program did. So talk to us about what Volcker did, what was wrong with it. You describe it here in the article.
Yeah, the Volcker tightening was really one of the great instances of monetary policy in the 20th century. It was an incredibly difficult and, for most of the time, unpopular thing to do. Even President Reagan wasn't super thrilled about it in the beginning. But Chairman Volcker stayed the course and did what needed to be done to actually get price hikes under control. And in the short run, that resulted in things like incredibly high interest rates, because in the short run, there is some connection between the stance of monetary policy and the price of capital. But ultimately, markets adjusted. They got weaned off quite difficultly, but weaned off nonetheless the easy liquidity that had proceeded from the previous chairmanship of Arthur Burns. And ultimately, it created the foundational prosperity that we enjoy for the next 20 to 30 years. The question is, can we do a similar thing now? Yeah, sure, it's possible. I'm just not sure that the key players in monetary policy and supporting political organizations have the willpower to make it happen.
There's literally a dearth of courage present. That's what you're asserting, and I tend to agree.
I think that that's one way of describing it. I think you look at some of these problems that really are incredibly complicated, and there are all good reasons in the world not to act. Stay the course, don't rock the boat, don't do anything that might upset financial markets that are already teetering a little bit because, again, of those geopolitical considerations that we talked about before. At the end of the day, inflation is caused by too much money chasing too few goods. We can't do a whole lot about the too few goods part, at least not in the short run, but we can do something about the too much money part. And ultimately, we have to get back to what our previous generation of economists ultimately knew. This is the exact same lesson that Milton Friedman taught us. When money growth outpaces income growth, real output growth, prices go up. The question is, are we going to be able to have the courage to put aside some of the fashionable but wrong economic theories and get back to what we know works, even if it is, quote unquote, old-fashioned?
Right. Because in monetary policy, I would say, and correct me if I'm wrong, that there is no old fashioned. There's just good monetary policy and bad monetary policy.
That's a very good way of putting it. Yeah. So everything old is new again, right? When we point to quote unquote old fashioned monetary policy, it turns out that that's just common sense applied to running the printing presses. There are some times when you want to do it conditional on having a central bank, and there are other times when you should really refrain. And it's actually a bit understandable that the people who tend to run the institutions associated with central banking are the kind of people who err on the side of printing more money rather than less, when prudence actually dictates we should be doing the opposite of that.
And it's not, again, it's not an issue of not knowing what to do. It's whether or not people have the courage to take steps to fix problems that have been created by what I've been calling nincompoops. And I'm sorry, that may not be the high-minded economic terminology we need at this moment, but I just feel very strongly that too many morons are in charge of our fiscal future.
There were definitely some questionable theories flying around. No doubt you've heard of modern monetary theory, the idea that government spending doesn't matter and we can just print money to cover deficits, and that's not going to have any adverse consequences on productive capacity or inflation or anything like that. And if you look at the recovery from the last crisis, following the 2007 through 2009 crisis, when the Federal Reserve massively expanded its balance sheet, but for a decade they couldn't even get inflation up to 2% if they tried. And so I think that in addition to a little bit of willful blindness, there was at least the countervailing tendency of, okay, we had 10 plus years of very, very low inflation, despite the fact that you had money printing going quite rapidly. So maybe that there's some justification for them being as confident as they were. But honestly, it's been known for months and months and months what we're actually staring in the face in terms of these pricing pressures. And so waiting as long as they did to start enacting contractionary monetary policy really wasn't justifiable, in my view.
And not justifiable, that's your kinder, gentler way of saying it was an unintelligent move. And so people are suffering. And for upper middle class and, wealthy individuals, a time of recession coupled with inflation means cutting back on vacations, cutting back on luxury purchases, maybe selling a boat or a condo. For families that are below or at that median household income for a family of four, this is a tragedy. And I think it's worth pointing that out because so many of our elected officials have left that era of their lives behind. They don't even remember or identify with being paycheck to paycheck or needing to balance a budget in order to make ends meet and get from, month to month.
There are definitely some distributional concerns with inflation. It's obviously going to be those whose paycheck isn't all that large to begin with that feel the brunt of the pain when the reduction in the dollar's purchasing power eats away their ability to actually consume goods and services. And that sounds all very sterile and abstract, but we're talking about real things here, right? We're talking about being able to keep the lights on. We're being able to afford heat in the wintertime. We're being able to afford however many, your full 3 meals a day for your family. This gets pretty real pretty quick. And I think that when we're looking at the national income statistics, when we're looking at the inflation data, when we're looking at wage data, it's pretty easy sometimes to forget that there are actual people behind those numbers. And when it comes to inflation, it's always the people least capable of bearing the pain who unfortunately have to shoulder that pain.
Yep. And it is the responsibility of those who are elected and those placed with who've chosen to be a part of our economic system and in charge of things like inflation and monetary policy to take those people's lives into consideration as well so that their actions are accountable. I'm so glad that you wrote this article. It's linked over at the show notes at stacyontheright.com. Always a pleasure to have you here, sir. Alexander Salter, economics professor at the Rawls College of Business at Texas Tech University. Such a pleasure to have you with us as always. 866-95-PATRIOT. We'll be right back.